Mi dite quando possiamo cominciare, per favore? Possiamo? Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming to this panel. As you know, because we are here, this is about journalism as activism. Why this panel? Activism actually is not only about marching, going on the street, or campaigning for a cause, or blogging. Activism can be also the job that a journalist do. When is activism? When the journalists touch uncomfortable truth and unpopular topics, or when they endanger their safety just to denounce regimes, situation which don't work. And we have some examples here. My guests are actually very different from each other. Their experience is very, very different from each other. And this also will prove how we can be activists as a journalist, and maybe all of us as a journalist should be activists. Let me introduce them. At my right side is Andrew Mwenda, who is an Ugandan journalist known for his fierce criticism to Western aid to Africa, and is also managing director of The Independent, which covers stories in Uganda, Rwanda, Tanzania, South Sudan. Is correct? Okay. At my right side is Ismail Einashe, a freelance journalist. He's from Somalia but based in London. Mm-hmm. And censorship is one of the themes he touched in his articles. And he also has written about Sicilian mafia and the plight of African migrants in Italy, which is something a little bit strange for an African journalist. We'll talk about this. And at my left side, there is Antoine Kaburahe. He's a director of Iwaku, one of the few remaining independent newspapers in Burundi. He was forced to leave the country, to live in exile in Belgium, because of the brutal dictatorship of Nkurunziza. And really, I would like to start with him, because Antoine, you are an example of how being a journalist in a country, in an African country, can be a challenge, can be a danger for the safety of the person, no? Now you're living in exile. Can you tell us shortly your story and why you were forced to flee the country?
Okay. As she said, I have been forced to leave because the freedom of press is not anymore there in Burundi. Today we have more than 100. Yes, I have been forced to leave Burundi because it was not anymore possible to work. It was very dangerous. Today we have more than 100 journalists live abroad in exile because two years ago
there was a putsch against the president Nkurunziza, and this putsch fell, and after the president and the journalists have been accused to be against the president. So it's very, very difficult now to work in Burundi as a journalist.
But Iwaku is still working, is he still publishing? So how you are managing to publish, how many journalists are there in the country, are still in the country, or are publishing from outside the country?
Now we are using social media, Twitter, Facebook, WhatsApp, because the social media can't be stopped. It's very difficult to stop Facebook, or if of course we can cut internet, but now even the journalists who are in exile, they have launched radio or web radio to try to continue to work, even it's very difficult. So it's the only way now is to try to do the job in a difficult condition.
Are you fearing some threats, or there have been some they cut the social media in this time?
Yes, it's very hard. Last year, one of our journalists has been killed. We didn't find his body. He was arrested, and nobody until now knows who he is. It is still very difficult to work.
We will talk later about the role of a Western media in telling what is happening in Burundi. Ismail is quite unusual for an African journalist, even though you are half African, half European now, to write about migration, which is actually something which is involve Africa, no? Mm-hmm. So when you start to write about this issue, and if you find any problems or challenge.
Okay. Is that on? Hi everyone. Is that on? Hi, thanks so much for having me. So I'm a freelance journalist who's based in London, originally from Somalia. I grew up in Ethiopia, and I have been covering issues to do with freedom of the press. Yeah, is that on? No? Okay, closer. I don't know if this is on. Is it on?
Can you help us to understand if...
Okay, it's on. Hi.
Okay.
Hello. Okay. Oh, that's great. It's this amazing room. The sort of voice goes right to the ceiling. Hi, everyone. So my name is Ismail Inashe. I'm a freelance journalist who's based in London, originally from Somalia. I grew up in Ethiopia. And I cover issues in East Africa, largely around freedom of expression, censorship, and freedom of the press, reporting for various media, Guardian, Prospect, Atlantic, and so on. And for the last few years, I've been working with journalists working in places like Kenya, Ethiopia, who are on the front line, who often are taking on very difficult jobs, doing the necessary on-the-ground reporting. So this whole idea of activism and journalism in the context in Africa, my experience has been that in Africa there isn't that luxury of having that choice. Because you're a journalist covering very sensitive issues, you are inevitably an activist. So I have been in Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia, and so on, covering these issues. And just to answer your question in regards to migration, so I'm based in London, so I've been covering the migrant crisis for the last few years. I've spent quite a bit of time in Italy, in Sicily, doing stories of people who, have been depicted in the media, and I guess we'll probably touch on this later, in a kind of narrow, self-serving kind of depiction. But I've been telling these stories of Africans who make these enormous journeys across the African continent via Libya, and the experience I've had as a journalist who's of African descent, but who also has the privilege of a British passport, is interesting, because I've had problems with the Italian police who assume I'm a migrant, who said to me, well, you can't be a journalist because I suppose they assume, there aren't any black journalists who are doing these stories, and that's often a reality. So I guess I have both the inside-outsider role, and that's an interesting dynamic. And yeah, maybe I'll leave it there. And you can...
Yes, Ismail is very interested, because you can't be, as a black person, you can't be a journalist. There is
in Sicily, yes. I mean,
right?
I've been stopped and searched to all kinds of business. Yeah.
But what about the people, or the common people you interview? How they react when you see you? Asking them questions, and because we are used to Western journalists to cover this issue of migration, but it's unusual to see a black journalist cover these stories.
Well, I guess this kind of touches upon your panel yesterday, and I see Ronda at the front there, but we have these kind of very defined sense of, who's a journalist, who isn't, who gets to cover. So for me, the experiences in East Africa, when I've been in Somalia and Ethiopia interviewing refugees, often they say to me, well, I'm not going to talk to you because, you're like us, and, what's the point? I'm going to talk to white journalists because they might help my case, they might get me heard. And then on the other hand, in Southern Europe, reporting in Sicily, often I get insights, nuances, kind of detail of a person's journey that other people, who are, I guess, European white journalists reporting on the migrant crisis might not. So I guess it's a bit of both. I think the issue generally, when it comes to, people like me covering these stories, is that in the context in Southern Europe, I have a challenge. In the context in Africa, I have a privilege. So the issue is the journalists I work on who are on the ground. People like Yasin Juma, who's a friend who's in Kenya, who's reporting on Al-Shabaab, who's been arrested, who's had his family threatened, and I did a report last year with him for The Guardian. So those are the people. I feel very privileged because I have a British passport, which allows me the privilege of not, necessarily facing the worst aspects of problems on the ground that people face in Africa.
Thank you. Andrew, I invited you at this panel after I saw a TED talk, and I thought, oh, nice. Somebody is thinking the way I'm thinking. I come to the point. The more I live in Africa, the more I think that aid is quite dangerous and is giving more problems than benefits. And then I saw your talk, and I thought, okay, it's not only about Dambisa Moyo. There is somebody else committed to this point. So why you think that Western aid is bad for your continent?
Okay, there we go. First of all, thank you so much, Antonella, for inviting an old man of 104 years, like me, to speak to young people who are like my great-grandchildren here. Look, if I speak very fast, so keep reminding me if I become very fast. The problem that Africa faces when I speak against aid, they think I'm only speaking about financial aid. Africa is controlled and dominated largely by the West on every arm and leg of her existence. So our story is told by CNN, BBC, the New York Times, or the Guardian. Our people who are hungry are fed by World Food Programme. Our sick are treated by Médecins Sans Frontières. Our wars are ended by UN peacekeepers. Our corruption is fought by Transparency International. Our policies are shaped by the World Bank. Our leaders are tried by the International Criminal Court. Our poverty is fought by Bono, Jeffrey Sachs, and Angelina Jolie. Our charity is provided by Oxfam and Action Aid. Our bureaucracies are staffed by people from USAID and DFID. We travel to Cambridge and Oxford, Harvard and Stanford to study and learn who we are, what we are, where we want to go, how we feel. In other words, we are all around dominated. And my journalism is to say we Africans must take responsibility for our actions, and we must define ourselves, and the future of Africa and Africans will only be done by Africans. Europeans and North Americans are too much involved in our lives, and they need to learn to leave us alone. We can kill each other, we will get out of it like they did. The Second World War, by the way, killed 76 million people. Africa's civil wars combined in the last 70 years haven't even killed 10% of what the Europeans killed. So, please leave us to define our destiny. And that is the greatest gift you can give us. Thank you.
And, now we are more an opinionist than a journalist. That is also important, no? To change the way of thinking in your continent. But you are also a consultant of, if I'm right, of World Bank.
Yes,
right?
I have worked a couple of times
and then of Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda, for so many years now. So there is no little bit of it's not a little bit controversial. You say, stop the Western aid, but there are so many NGOs in Rwanda, for example, and World Bank is still giving money. So how are you dealing with this? It's a little bit tricky.
There is an Austrian economist called Joseph Schumpeter. After the First World War, the Austrian government put him on a commission, I think, to decide how to regulate the economy, and he had been a believer in a free market economy. So they asked him, how do you, as Schumpeter, sit on this regulatory commission? He said, you see, if somebody is going to commit suicide, it's always good to have a doctor present. So the same applies to me. I don't agree with the World Bank, but whenever World Bank is trying to put a rope around Africa's necks, it's good to have me as a doctor available to give them my unwelcome advice, which they never take, of course. So yes, I have been a consultant for the World Bank, but I have not been a consultant for President Paul Kagame. I sit on his Presidential Advisory Council, so I volunteer my advice to him, yes. As a journalist, I feel I am not only just a journalist, by the way. I'm well read in economics, in public policy. I feel I am arrogant enough to believe that I have a wealth of knowledge, and I can contribute to presidents and advise them on how to govern. Even my own president, I either advise him when he invites me for breakfast, or I advise him in my newspaper when I'm writing articles. So, yes, I do provide pro bono services to any president, whoever I meet. I volunteer advice. By the way, even Tony Blair one time invited me, and I advised him on his Africa Commission. He had formed a commission to give Africa aid and cancel debt, and I appeared in London. He invited me to London, and I advised him against giving aid and cancelling debt. So I advise any leader who approaches me. In case the Prime Minister of Italy is interested, I am willing to volunteer my advice to him for free. He doesn't need to pay.
For sure, you will find job here too. But I would like to go back to Burundi, because the situation there is very, very sad. And what is sad more is that what happened there is quite unknown, and is quite unknown in Italy. So we were talking about activism, that all of us journalists should be activists. How is the covering of the story on the Western media, or the Italian media, but the Western media in general, about Burundi?
Okay. Sorry for my English is not perfect because I'm a French speaker normally, but I want to say that this term of activist, I don't like this term, because normally a journalist is a journalist. But in some conditions, a journalist is also a witness. And in Burundi, it's very difficult to cover the information if you are abroad, for example. People who are in Rwanda or in Uganda, I mean journalists in Rwanda, in Uganda, in Kenya, they have no access to the field. A journalist must go to the field to investigate, to see, to verify. And the risk of making a journalism of opinion is very high. But when there is a kind of blackout, I say we must do what we can to try to continue to inform as we can. And especially when media from West are not anymore present. Before there was BBC, VOA, Deutsche Welle, but now there are less journalists from Europe because the situation is still sometimes very, very difficult. So it's not, I'm not comfortable with the term of activist, but the situation, in the situation we live, I understand, and it's a big honor for my colleagues in Burundi who try to continue to inform.
So you say that you are continuing doing your job through the social media, especially through the social media. But now, who are your sources? Maybe the journalists who are still there, maybe the people who are there, your families, how you get the information?
Okay. There are some topics very sensitive to treat. And journalists try to do the job, but to stay in life also. So there are many topics which they avoid. Sometimes it's a kind of censor, but this is the situation. And we are happy that there are social media. If we have no social media, it will be very, very hard to know what is going on in the country.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Ismail, the last question then, if from the audience you want to come with some questions, they are very willing to answer. And what about censorship? This is another topic you are working on. Can you tell us more about your job, Lisa?
Yes, so I report for Index on Censorship, which is a magazine which is published quarterly. It covers issues of freedom of expression and censorship across the world, and I'm the East Africa reporter, so I cover issues of that in East Africa. So the threats to journalists has definitely increased. We see that in places such as Ethiopia, where there has been an enormous crackdown led by the government against the Oromo community, which are the largest ethnic community in that country. And this question of censoring and shutting down journalists as an instrument of state power is certainly something you see not just in Ethiopia, but you see in Kenya, in Rwanda, lots of other examples across the continent where the state feels emboldened to shut down journalists. So if we think then about who's an activist, who's a journalist, and Antoine was mentioning the role of social media in all of this, which is very important, these lines get very blurred. So I don't quite like the idea of sort of bringing this activist label, because if you're Zone 9 bloggers who I've worked with and reported about in Ethiopia, they started out as an outfit on Facebook because that was the only space available in Ethiopia to get information across to people. For example, Ethiopia has very low internet penetration in comparison to Kenya, for example. Then they effectively became journalists, and now some of them have fled into exile because of the threats they face. So in Ethiopia, in these places, censorship is increasing, and at Index on Censorship, I cover these issues. So I'm in touch with people on the ground who are campaigning as actual activists and journalists who are reporting on very sensitive things. And the other dimension to all of this is also the role of businesses. So, in Safaricom, for example, in Kenya has had a hand in, getting rid of material that it didn't like about them. So it's not just the state, it's also businesses are engaged. And maybe just to pick up a point that you were saying earlier about, the role of the West and Africa, I think sometimes maybe the mirror should be reflected back on us, because yes, there are lots of things historically recent that the West has, but also African governments are responsible for shutting down the freedom of the press and challenging journalists, arresting people. And one of the key things that I've noticed, perhaps just quickly to share, across East Africa, I think it's also probably applicable to other parts of Africa, such as Cameroon, I know, is the usage of terror laws. So the state uses terror laws on the statute books to try and silence and shut down journalists. So we have to be vigilant and very vocal about that. And perhaps the final thing to say is also in the age of Trump is that, this sort of strongman kind of leadership is emboldening kind of dictators and bad leaders in Africa to, effectively kind of shut down the press. And it was your session yesterday that Ron was talking about this. So that's a pattern that's increasing and increasing, unfortunately.
Andrew, we were telling, when I was presenting you, I said that you are also managing director of the Independent. And we like the word independence. But maybe you don't like this question, but the question is, ever happened to you to censor some of your journalists to some topic?
No, not at all. I should tell you, when we are writing, we write without fear or favor of anybody or any authority. And for us, it's always an advantage if the state is hostile to us, because then they become our marketing managers. First of all, if there is a dictator in Africa, like there are dictators all over Europe and North America, by the way, I think that Uganda, where I practice my journalism, is freer than the United States under Obama. Although as Africans, we have this idea that our situation is always bad and other situations are very good. American media are heavily compromised by corporate interests. What they say must be in agreement with power. Please watch CNN, read the New York Times. The position of the State Department on Syria, on Cuba, on Iran is the position of CNN, is the position of the New York Times and the Washington Post. Because I don't see a difference in the position of the American State Department in its foreign policy and American media, it tells me that journalists in America and the mass media are one and the same. So you cannot say there is press freedom there. And in Uganda, we have a joke. Idi Amin used to say, there is your freedom of speech, but I cannot guarantee for you freedom after speech. So, my friend, the British journalists, for me, represent the British Foreign Ministry. There is no reason for the British government to be hostile to its journalists because they are not doing their work as they preach to us. Journalists in Uganda and in Africa are much more serious. When the Ugandan troops went into Congo, practically every newspaper in Uganda opposed Ugandan involvement in the Congo. When American troops were invading Iraq, practically every American journalist was falling themselves over George Bush, supporting it. All the greatest columnists I know. Yes?
Slow down.
Yeah, oh, sorry. So I get the sense that there is less censorship in the West because journalists and power are all together in one bed. Power is financed by corporate interests own media. The media cannot say anything to challenge power. They can criticize tactical problems, but they cannot go at the fundamental structure of power in the West. It's not challenged. The first time it was challenged, I think, by an alternative ideology called communism. The communist parties were banned. More than that, you should see the coverage of terrorism. The West's actions in the Middle East are the cause of what we see as terrorism. There's so many academic studies that have been done to prove this. Journalists don't cover that. So it's not true that your societies here in the West are free. It is simply that your media are compromised. So let me come back to Africa. Yes, if we have a tin pot dictator there, it's our responsibility to fight for our freedom. It's not the responsibility of anybody else to fight for freedom. If the Europeans are free, they fought for their freedom. They went through 2 international wars, 2 world wars. They went through censorship, through Nazism and fascism until they achieved what they have today. I think Africans also should look at ourselves. What is my contribution today to expanding the frontiers of freedom? What is my responsibility today to expand the frontiers of press freedom, the frontiers of democracy? Every day, we should ask ourselves that. But the idea that we should outsource our freedom, the struggle for our freedom, to Europeans, to North Americans, that's a very dangerous idea. In fact, as you have seen, the Libyans outsourced their democratization to Obama, Cameron, and Sarkozy. Has any one of you been to Libya? You go to Afghanistan and Iraq, and you will see the disasters of foreign interventions that are to promote freedom. They tend to promote anarchy. So in societies like Tunisia, where the struggle for democracy was by the people of Tunisia, without international interference, there is an evolving democratic system. Democracy goes in back and forth in fits and starts. It's never straightforward. But the people most affected must be the ones who take control of that struggle. It must not be hijacked. So if you're an African, I advise you, please don't allow anybody from anywhere to hijack your struggle for freedom.
Antoine, do you agree? Maybe you were forced to flee your country because you didn't compromise enough with Nkurunziza or something?
No. I was doing my job as journalist, but it's very difficult to be a journalist in some regime, in some countries. If you see the rank of Reporters Sans Frontières, how do you say in English?
Journalists Without Borders?
Reporters Without Borders.
Yes.
Reporters Without Borders.
Yes, we can see how countries are free or no, and when you see the country where the freedom is very few, it's the country where the authorities are not. Don't allow the freedom of press. But I think it's also our duty to still to continue with what we can. If we have to use Twitter, if we have to use Facebook, if we have to use WhatsApp or any social media, I think it's important, even it's not a classical journalism. Mm-hmm. Time is hard. We have to face it. We have to accept to use special skills to continue to survive, to continue to even we can be killed or put in jail. We have a big responsibility to continue to inform people.
So before the May 2015, when Nkurunziza announced that he wanted to run for the third term, the situation was quite different in your country.
Burundi was like an example. In the Central Africa, we had radio stations, we have a newspaper, we have civil society, very, very dynamic, very free. We had a synergy of media. For example, during elections, all independent media, we were working together to do the information. And now this is not...
It's completely lost.
Yeah. It's very sad. It's a sad story.
Yes, for sure. Do you know how many of your colleagues are still in the country, and yes, if you have contact with them?
I know that we have more than 100 in exile. There are also some journalists continue working inside the country, but the situation is very, very, I say, not with the dynamism we had before.
Mm-hmm. It means also that we don't have first-hand information. Can we say we don't have first-hand information now? Because if nobody is there or only few are there and they are just scared or threatened, yes, maybe we don't have the right information of what is going on.
It's very hard today to have fresh information, but there's still always some journalists working on the field, and they are very brave to continue this job in these conditions.
Mm-hmm. I saw Iwaku, and there are a lot of news, actually. So all those journalists are covering the stories of their country from outside the country?
No. Iwachu, we have more than 28 journalists in Burundi, and one, of course, unfortunately, is missing. But 28 journalists are working inside the Burundi.
This is also a curiosity I have. Are they volunteering or are they getting a salary? Are they paid, these journalists?
Yeah, this is another problem, economics problem. Sometimes we have grants, some foundations who support the few media who are working, because advertising is there are no anymore advertising, but some foundations, for example, for Iwachu, we have a partnership with a newspaper in France, Le Monde. They support sometimes. We have a Switzerland foundation who help to pay the journalists, something like that. But it's not a normal situation. In a normal situation, a newspaper, a radio, a television must win money with advertising. It's a company who win money. We don't have to ask money to run a media.
Of course, and then in this way you depend from a Western aid in some way.
What you was saying.
Yes, in this condition you can't say not.
I hope he understands our situation. Even in his country, it's okay. But I think he understands. Yes. Am I right?
Because theory is something, but then putting in practice is quite more difficult.
Yeah, well, just to echo Antoine's point, I'm sure in Uganda it's wonderful, and I'm glad for you that you don't have as many challenges, but it's a fact that there are threats to journalists in Africa by African governments. African journalists are jailed. People I know, people I've worked with, reported on. So I think that's good. In Uganda, you say, I haven't been to Uganda, I haven't reported from Uganda, but you say that. The other thing Antoine pointed also is we should look at the data here. So we should look at the work done by CPJ, Reporters Without Borders, Article 19, and others who've done research. This is pinpointed, verified information on the ground. And maybe just to come back to the point you're making about freedom of the press and the differences between the West and Africa. I've just been in the US for the last several months and doing a fellowship at Columbia University, and there, of course, Trump has launched a war against the media, repeatedly attacking the New York Times, the Post, and so on. So I do accept that there are threats to journalists everywhere. The point isn't whether there's more threats here or there. The point is, are there threats? Yes, there are threats to journalists, and there are threats to the freedom of the press. And where we see those threats, where we see the light being extinguished, where we see there are threats to journalists who are doing important work, getting the stories that are needed, then we ought to support them. And I think the other point you make is actually quite important. Africans should be telling their stories. And it shouldn't always be this CNN and BBC and other people who come and, your session explored this yesterday about the ways in which Africa is covered and the kind of helicopter journalism, people who parachute in, spend a week, get a very, skewed kind of vision of that country and that society. So we have to empower African journalists, skill them up, and allow them to tell their own stories and not have, CNN and Deutsche Welle and whoever else mediate that. But I do think, just again to make that point, and we just heard this, amazing testimony from Antoine, that the situation in Burundi is terrible, and he's faced, with these threats that he and his colleagues are going through. So I think we should be focusing on that right now.
Yes. And I should tell you one thing. You see, if journalists in Africa face threats from the state because they are doing their job, journalists in the West don't face threats from the state because they are not doing their job. Listen, just last week, I think this week, the American government killed 200 innocent civilians in a bomb raid in Mosul. 200. 2 days ago, the Syrian government killed 70 people using gas attack, or what do they call it? Chemical weapon. It doesn't matter whether you kill somebody with a chemical weapon or a normal bomb. The American government has attacked Syria for killing 70. Why didn't anyone attack America for killing 200 in Mosul? The journalists of America were reporting it as a mistake. Why don't they report the one of Syria as also a mistake? This is the point I'm making, my friends. It's not true that there is freedom here. At least not in America. I've not lived in Italy. I've lived in America. There's no freedom there. If journalists are not harassed in America, it's because they are in alliance with power. They're in bed with power. For me, I'm proud of African journalists. You know why? We go to jail. I have 13 criminal charges against me in Uganda because we do our job. So I don't want to come here as an African and say that I am a victim, I need CPJ, or all this paraphernalia of Western nonsense.
But we are.
Okay.
I don't think we are saying here.
That's not what we're saying, and I'm sorry, but that's
that
not
African
what it is like for
journalists-
Yasin Juma and for a lot of journalists. I mean,
Yes.
you might wear this as a badge of pride, and I respect that, but for people who are on the ground, who are reporting, it's not a bloody badge of pride when you're jailed and you have your family threatened. So, just for the record, I say that.
And
Well,
then-
I think,
sorry.
Antoinette, let me tell you one thing.
And then we,
Antoniella-
just 2 minutes, and because I want the other people have the chance to ask question.
Our,
So if you can-
our founding father from Ghana, where you come from, Kwame Nkrumah, said, freedom is not a commodity that is given to the enslaved upon demand. It is a precious reward, the shining trophy of struggle and of sacrifice. You can never be free unless you struggle and you sacrifice. For me, I think being arrested as a journalist is a badge of honor. It shows that you're doing your job. If politicians are kissing you, shaking your hand and approving what you do, it's very likely that they're not doing your job. So if we want to be free, we have to struggle and sacrifice.
Okay, thank you very much. And then I would like to ask somebody from the audience if there are questions. I'm sure you have, because these are very sensitive issues. And as you can see, we don't think the same. I mean, okay, there's somebody.
Hi, my name is Mary. I'm a Cameroonian, but I stay in Kenya, so I have perspective on both countries. And what I'll say is, to some extent, I agree with him, because I'm also practicing journalism, and for me, and for many people on the ground, Africans who are there, the question is, why are there journalists who are on exile wherever they are coming to tell the story? And why are the journalists on the ground, when their stories are told, they're being arrested and they're the ones who are being made to look bad? But people are coming from outside, people are doing whatever from outside. You've decided to run away, so you shouldn't be coming to tell us what is happening to us. That is in Cameroon. So then I know also in Kenya, I personally know even Hassan, whom you mentioned. I know that people get arrested and everything, but they still fight and they still stay in the country. The situation will be different from Burundi, so I won't compare it to Burundi because that's understandable. But for me, I still feel like, to some extent, people should still push on, because at the end of the day, if it hasn't gotten to the extent of Burundi, and there are people who are staying in Kenya, there's one called Mohammed Ali. He does a story once a year, then he disappears, but in the country. He doesn't go outside the country to go and hide in, Europe or in America or whatever. And for me, I feel like that's where I get his concept, where you don't need to run to the West for help. You can still do your story, you can still be a journalist, but still be in the country. And if you're not being disturbed in African countries as a journalist, to be honest, you're not doing your job.
Anywhere in the world.
Sorry.
Including Italy.
For sure, people can decide for their own if they want to be killed for a cause or not. This is the point. This is also the point. Somebody else?
Do you think there's an equal amount of a problem on reporting on Africa for an African audience as there is on reporting on Africa for an international audience?
I beg your pardon?
I didn't hear the question.
Excuse me?
Can you repeat the question?
We didn't hear the question.
No.
I need to get her question right.
I'm just wondering if the biggest problem is reporting on what's going on in Africa to reach an African audience, so the people who are living there, or if it's much more important to be telling the rest of the world what on earth is going on that they don't understand yet.
Should I answer it?
Yeah.
Okay, you answered before.
First of all, I am very conscious of the fact that many of us, because of the ideological ecosystem in which we live, West African journalists, we want to report our problems in order to win sympathy from the West. And the West has views of Africa as a place of marauding dictators harassing journalists. So I think the West is able to feel good about itself by identifying the other called Africa as bad. And us Africans, we have fallen into that game and we need to run away from it. We need to look at our sacrifices, our struggles as ours and take pride in them, but refuse others to define us as being backward and them being better. And I think that is the biggest problem that we face. Because I don't think that Western society is better than African society. I think all leaders everywhere are the same. They play the same rules. They all want power. Our leaders are not any different. And the journalists in the West have failed in their job because they're in bed with the politicians.
Can I ask you, to Antoine, if you received during this year of exile, of struggling, any sympathy for some of your African colleagues, or any help, or even economic help from your African colleagues?
Yes. Yes, I do. For example, the journalists who are living in Rwanda, they have assistance from Press House of Rwanda. They have a house they can live and two meals per day. It's a very concrete support. In Uganda also, I think there is a help to journalists who are living there. But the problem is that in Africa, all journalists are not very rich, or they don't have much money. But the sympathy,
even moral support is
yes,
important.
and it's very important. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have the support of African associations, African media. It's no problem about that.
Mm-hmm. If there is any other question, Ismail.
Just to answer your question, and I'll come back to your question, but I think we're conflating a lot of issues here. So as far as I'm aware, this panel I was invited to, we were discussing activism and journalism in Africa, and then we moved into discussing censorship and threats to journalism in Africa. There's a lot. The relationship between the West and Africa, the history of colonialism, wars in the Middle East. There's a lot going on. But I just want to come back to your point. Yes, I think there's a difference, unfortunately, between, the international news about Africa isn't really for Africans, and that's the problem, right? So journalists go to the ground, and I agree with you, they tell a story which is all about the disasters and the wars and all of that, and they go there for a week. These are, Western journalists, and that's to an international audience who get a very skewed picture of what is going on the ground. But increasingly, there are lots of examples across the continent where people are beginning to do, their own journalism. There are obviously lots of really great African journalist institutions. So that is, hopefully an antidote to some of that. And to your point, yes, if you're able to fight as a journalist who's been arrested or threatened, if you're able to fight and stay in Kenya and, you're able to do that safely, then do. But not everybody has that choice. So we shouldn't... I'm very conscious of the narrative of saying, because you're in exile, somehow, you've escaped or you've left. Well, people don't have that choice in Eritrea, a country I've reported on, and I know Eritrean journalists, is probably one of the most closed-off countries in the world. It's impossible to be a journalist there. There are journalists that are still in prison. So I think we have to recognize that Africa is a big place, and when we talk about it, I only say I know East Africa because that's what I reported on, the region I know well. So I think the lessons that we take from West East Africa, there might be some general patterns, but they are different. So I think what I'm for is, getting a nuanced, better picture of what's going on the ground, reporting that is done by African journalists because it's good journalism, because they know the local context, and stopping this, horrible business of people flying in and coming back and giving a picture of Africa which is incorrect. So that's... Yeah.
This is why it's so important that people, journalists, can do their job, are allowed to do their job, to stay in their own country and to do the job, because, as I was saying yesterday...
Antoine should be in his country right now.
Yes, exactly. I would like to read his own reporting from his country. I wouldn't like to... I don't like to have him here talking about this issue. I would like him to be there and reading the story from Burundi. I don't want to read story from parachute journalists. I don't want. So even in a Western country, Andrew, there are people who really want the rethinking of Africa. You are going to have a TED talk again, no? And for sure...
Is Snowden in America? Is Edward Snowden in America after exposing the criminal activities of Mr. Obama, whom this one is exonerating and says the problem is Trump?
I'm not exonerating. That's you're attributing stuff to
Trump.
me.
You should have complained about... Trump has not arrested a single journalist.
You know what? We are lucky.
He's
we are lucky because we are lucky because our time is gone.
He's apparently a journalist,
yes.
but he's attributing quotes
to
me,
which I
didn't
lucky
give. So
they are doing this
come
way,
on,
so
seriously.
we have to stop. We can continue to
Let's stop the fun here, right?
That I know that is a very, very, very important issue. This. And I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank you, my guests. And this conversation is also on streaming, so you can see it again and tell your friends too. Yes, and thank you for coming. See you again.
Thank you.
Knows who is, it is still very difficult to work.
We will talk later about the role of a Western media in telling what is happening in Burundi. Ismail is quite unusual for an African journalist, even though you are half African, half European now. To write about migration, which is actually something which is involve Africa, no? So when you start to write about this issue, and if you find any problems or challenge.
Okay. Is that on? Hi everyone. Is that on? Hi, thanks so much for having me. So I'm a freelance journalist who's based in London, originally from Somalia. I grew up in Ethiopia, and I've been covering issues to do with freedom of the press. Yeah, is that on? No? Okay, closer. I don't know if this is on. Is it on?
Can you help us to understand if...
Okay, it's on. Hi.
Okay.
Hello. Okay. Oh, that's great. It's this amazing room. The sort of voice goes right to the ceiling. Hi, everyone. So my name is Ismail Inashe. I'm a freelance journalist who's based in London, originally from Somalia. I grew up in Ethiopia. And I cover issues in East Africa largely around freedom of expression, censorship, and freedom of the press, reporting for various media, Guardian, Prospect, Atlantic, and so on. And for the last few years, I've been working with journalists,
And we have some examples here. My guests are actually very different from each other. Their experience is very, very different from each other. And this also will prove how we can be activists as a journalist, and maybe all of us as a journalist should be activists. Let me introduce them. At my right side is Andrew Mwenda, who is an Ugandan journalist known for his fierce criticism to Western aid to Africa, and is also managing director of The Independent, which covers stories in Uganda, Rwanda, Tanzania, South Sudan. Is correct? Okay. At my right side is Ismail Einashe, a freelance journalist. He's from Somalia but based in London. Mm-hmm. And censorship is one of the themes he touched in his articles. And he also has written about Sicilian mafia and the plight of African migrants in Italy, which is something a little bit strange for an African journalist. We'll talk about this. And at my left side, there is Antoine Kaburahe. He's a director of Iwaku, one of the few remaining independent newspapers in Burundi. He was forced to leave the country.
This putsch fell, and after the president and the journalists have been accused to be against the president. So it's very, very difficult now to work in Burundi as a journalist.
But Iwaku is still working, is still publishing. So how you are managing to publish, how many journalists are there in the country, are still in the country, or are publishing from outside the country?
Now we are using social media, Twitter, Facebook, WhatsApp, because the social media can't be stopped. It's very difficult to stop Facebook, or if of course we can cut internet, but now even the journalists who are in exile, they have launched radio or web radio to try to continue to work, even it's very difficult. So it's the only way now is to try to do the job in a difficult condition.
Are you fearing some threats, or there have been some they cut the social media in this time?
Yes, it's very hard. Last year, one of our journalists has been killed. We didn't find his body. He was arrested, and nobody until now.
Mi dite quando possiamo cominciare, per favore? Possiamo? Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming to this panel. As you know, because we are here, this is about journalism as activism. Why this panel? Activism actually is not only about marching, going on the street, or campaigning for a cause, or blogging. Activism can be also the job that a journalist do. When is activism? When the journalists touch uncomfortable truth and unpopular topics, or when they endanger their safety just to denounce regimes, situation which don't work. To live in exile in Belgium because of the brutal dictatorship of Nkurunziza. And really, I would like to start with him, because Antoine, you are an example of how being a journalist in a country, in an African country, can be a challenge, can be a danger for the safety of the person, no? Now you're living in exile. Can you tell us shortly your story and why you were forced to flee the country?
Okay. As she said, I have been forced to leave because the freedom of press is not anymore there in Burundi. Today we have more than 100.
Yes, I have been forced to leave Burundi because it was not anymore possible to work. It was very dangerous. Today we have more than 100 journalists live abroad in exile because two years ago there was a putsch against the president Nkurunziza, and